Hello and welcome to our online audience for this event on the future of multilateral development cooperation. We're delighted that you could join us. My name is Anthony Dworkin, as it says on the screen. I'm Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, working on a range of subjects connected with international order and multilateralism. And we're delighted to be doing this event on a very timely subject and with two fantastic participants joining me here. Gunilla Carlsson, who's currently the chair of the governing board of SIDA, Swedish Development Agency, former development minister, and with a lot of experience both in Sweden and in different multilateral organizations on development. And also joining us, Thomas Melonio. We're delighted to have you from AFD, the French Development Agency, and again, with wide experience across the French development system and the French government more generally. So a lot of knowledge on the panel and also in the audience, I know. And this discussion is coinciding with the publication of a paper that I've just brought out for ECFR on multilateral development in flux, exploring changing European attitudes to multilateral development cooperation. And the paper is the conclusion of a project that I've done, or we've done at ECFR, in cooperation with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them for their support. And as part of the project, we did 4 roundtables in 4 key European capitals, Paris, Berlin, London, and Stockholm, looking particularly at the way thinking in those countries was evolving on multilateral cooperation, and then trying to draw together some conclusions. And those are the subjects that we're going to be talking about today. I'll very quickly, I think all been shared a link to the report, so I don't want to take too long to dwell on that. But I would just say very quickly, for me, this was a really interesting project. And I know a number of people who were in the roundtables are also in this discussion, so it will be interesting to hear also your reflections. But really, I took away a strong sense that there is, across the board, that this is a kind of moment of rethinking, that there's a lot of attention and reflection going on as to how the multilateral development system should evolve and adapt to a kind of rather different international climate. And, it's we looked at these 4 countries, and it would be perhaps a bit crude to summarize in one line what came out for each, but at the risk of simplifying, I would say, in France, we picked up a very strong interest in innovation and reform in the system. Obviously, President Macron hosted the summit earlier this year on the global financing architecture, global financial pact. In Germany, similarly, a strong interest in relations with the global south, a growing commitment to engagement in multilateralism, but I think there also a real persistence in seeing the importance of broad collective institutions and of the kind of rules-based order as a whole. In Sweden, I know Gunilla will talk more about this, but clearly there's a lot of rethinking going on, and I think a sense of maybe trying to connect development policy more closely to Swedish policy as a whole, to Swedish interests and Swedish values in the areas of human rights, and more kind of with an emphasis on trade and integrating countries into the global trading system. And in the UK, well, we just brought out our paper a few days after the new development white paper came out here in the UK. So in Britain, I think there's been quite a kind of journey over the last few years with a strong swerve away from multilateralism in the previous development strategy, or the most recent development strategy. But now with the white paper, as we saw also in the roundtable, I think a move to switch back to more focus on multilateral organizations, more focus on global challenges, and connecting development work quite strongly to the eradication of global poverty and sustainable development goals. So that's a kind of very brief snapshot, and just very quickly to pull together a few themes that came out for me of the report. There was a sense that there's more politics in the area of development cooperation than there was perhaps 10 years ago. But at the same time, I felt a strong persistence of pragmatism, a sense that the choice between multilateral and bilateral avenues is also really driven by a sense of which is best for the goals that governments are seeking to achieve. There is a strong consensus, which really was the headline of the report, around the need for kind of change, innovation, rethinking at a time of a complex and different international environment, more geopolitics, changing views from the global south, new kinds of challenges. There's a sense that the system is growing more complex. There is a common theme, again, quite an interesting theme for me, was the kind of commitment to align development policy in this competitive era more closely with foreign policy as a whole, with strategic concerns. But as I said, to me, this isn't necessarily something that is leading to development policy being sort of subsumed or kind of subverted to serve other ends. It's more a question of alignment, of integration, of a sense that strategic goals now involve a component where development is really an important part of that. There's a clear growing focus on global public goods, climate most obviously, but pandemic disease, biodiversity, and so on. Along with that, a feeling of the need to balance different constituencies, a lot of discussion about is there a tension or coherence between the climate agenda and the poverty agenda. A sense that in the last few years of crisis, multilateralism had shown that it's more needed than ever, despite the difficulties, and also that it has some kind of advantages and values that serve it well in the crisis. And finally, to end on a political note, there is the complexity of China. The kind of global competition with China, I think, underpins a lot of the way that Europeans are kind of changing their views of the world, and yet also a sense that China is such a big player that a lot of things in the areas like debt, for instance, are not really going to happen without China. So how do we kind of navigate that question? It's also something that came out, but that really is enough from me. And it's time to turn to our speakers. Just before I turn to them, and we'll talk together for the first 20 or so minutes, and then open it up to questions from you. Now, to tell you that you should write if you want to come in, and I would really encourage people to come in, because there's a lot of expertise and knowledge and experience among the participants online. You should indicate in the Q&A function on Zoom that you would like to ask a question or make a comment. And we have the capacity to bring you up on the screen. And so if you indicate that you'd like to ask a question, we will do that. We'll come to you so you can ask your question. But if you would prefer, for whatever reason, not to do that, just put that in your comment and say, here's a question, I don't want to ask it directly myself. And in that case, I will ask it on your behalf. So with that, perhaps too long introduction, we're now going to get the perspective of Gunilla and Thomas, a little bit from your countries, but also with your experience and your sense of how multilateral development cooperation is changing, should change, and where it might be going. So Gunilla, maybe if I can come to you first. From your perspective in Sweden, obviously these questions are quite high on the agenda. How do you see your perspective on the changing role of multilateral cooperation?
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks to ECFR for a very interesting and timely report. I'd like to start from a perspective of multilateralism as a whole, and just to put Sweden into the Nordic context, because we are deeply committed for collaboration. It has benefited us well to stay out of wars and to work together with our close neighbors, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, to promote shared values, but also shared interests. And that goes also now with the European Union, of course. Sweden joined long after Denmark, that joined in 1973, but in 1994, Sweden and Finland could have a yes in the referendum, join European Union, and to be active partners there. Now we see with the NATO process, a multilateral collaboration based on mutual values that is so beneficiary for us and where Sweden wants to come. So I think the whole question of multilateral collaboration goes without saying that it's proven helpful, and that my country, Sweden, is deeply committed to that. Our commitment to UN, it is, of course, historically very generous core contributions to the development systems, but it is, of course, a commitment to international laws, human rights, sustainable development, and collaborative efforts to address global challenges, both normative, but also with resources. And we see multilateralism as the key instrument for promoting stability, peace, freedom, and so on and so forth. And has, as a medium-sized country, a lot to gain on multilateral collaboration. Also, if we see it in the broader landscape, where our industry is very global, our trade is huge compared to our population, and without the multilateral system, we wouldn't have been where we are today in our welfare systems. So we really see the benefits of that, and that's why I think we have tried to be very good actors in all aspects of multilateral collaboration, and trying to be part of also forming the whole landscape. Now, when we look into development, international development cooperation and the trends, there is, of course, now a tendency to become more adjusting to exactly what you said, to link it to foreign policy, to link it to where Sweden can play a role, but equally also where we, whether it's geographically in our neighborhood and the strong threats we feel on the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, we really see that we would like to do more in our close neighborhood together with like-minded. And that doesn't lead us away from multilateralism, but rather have another focus on where we traditionally has been. Now there is a perception that then we give up everything else, but that's actually not true. We can do both still, but I think sometimes the discourse is coming either or, but that's not the case. I also would like to say that I rather think we see adjustments right now, more focus on bilateral aid, but technically, and in order to deliver results, the agency SIDA that I represent, of course, will do more bilateral collaboration, because that is also a cost efficiency side of things. So there are many reasons why multilateral aid will not disappear, rather be strengthened, but perhaps more narrowed and more rooted in a reality where the politicians can walk the talk, but also put the resources where they have their thinking. I would also say that you mentioned a little bit about pragmatism, and I would say that there is a high rhetoric, perhaps described like Sweden first, or we have to take care of ourselves before we deal with others. But I think that as soon as we start to think like that, we realize that we are so dependent on each other. And also, as we are dependent, we are going into collaborations that are by nature multilateral. And I think there is a huge understanding from the public that this is how we do things. So I think one shouldn't exaggerate the different trends, the different adjustments. From a Nordic perspective, we have seen the same. We sometimes tends to shift in different focuses. Some put more emphasis on climate, others on health, or the combination of the two of them, just to mention examples. So I would say that you have captured it quite well in the report, how we work together and how we try to see how the evolving landscape now may redefine the narrative around emphasizing more strategic cooperation over what perhaps before could be seen as purely altruistic motives. This might be a more nuanced perspective, but it's recognizing ultimately that a well-structured and strategically motivated multilateral approach can serve both our national interests and the broader goal of global stability and development. I stop there and looking forward to the discussion.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Gunilla, and lots of interesting thoughts there to pick up on. Thomas, if I can come to you now, from your perspective, I mean, I know that, you know, these questions of thinking about the international financial system, the multilateral development banks, and how that it kind of is evolving and should evolve. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit, you know, how you see the priorities and direction in that area.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. I hope you can hear me well. So let me first thank ECFR for the invitation and also to the audience. I see a number of friends that were supposed to be online, so I hope you'll have questions later on. So maybe in a few words, like Gunilla, maybe I'll start by just a few seconds on the global perspective. So I think similar to, she alluded to it, but I feel more and more the pressure or the tensions between the developed countries and the rest of the world. Whether this is de-Westernization or anti-Western feelings, I don't know, but certainly we feel more pressure and criticism coming from developing countries, in particular with topics related to global public goods or global crisis. So we've seen tension rise along the climate topic, but also the COVID crisis has also fueled feelings that developed countries had not done enough. But you could say similar things on very purely political crises like the aggression of Ukraine, or even more recently situation in Palestine. So we've seen this rift expand, and certainly it's a matter for concern. Hence, I think a general feeling in French government, and again, I'm not a spokesperson for the French government, so I will just act as an analyst there, but maybe just give you my personal interpretation of the in particular important summit that took place last June, is that we feel the need to reform the international financial system, which is partly related to the debate on the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, but not only. And again, Gunilla said it in some manner that multilateralism is not just about multilateral institutions. There are other forms of corporations that can contribute to multilateralism on top of multilateral institutions established with that particular purpose. Maybe just to name a few topics that I think are still in the international debate and certainly within development banks. First, a need for more finance, and in particular concessional finance from MDBs, but also national development banks like EFD. In the current situation, we see that the interest rates are very high in developing countries, which generates more and more financial sustainability issues among developing countries, and it fuels difficult feelings for the countries which are indebted in a currency that is not their own. You have to put, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a finance minister in a developing countries. It's very hard to have a debt in a foreign currency and hence be dependent on the international system, in particular when the governance of that system is not inclusive enough or the financing volume is not sufficient enough. So one set of the debate is on whether MDBs, but also national institutions can provide more finance and leverage upon their balance sheet a bit more and take more risk, in particular in the current period where many developing countries do not have access to capital markets. So that's one set of reforms which can be explained or illustrated by very concrete measures like having a more important loan-to-equity ratio. For example, it's been debated at the World Bank, but also Asian Development Bank and others. So that's one way to reduce the gap between developed and developing countries. One important topic during the June summit was also to incentivize institutions to be more creative and more innovative in terms of finance, typically to provide long-term loans, that can take into account the possibility of climate shocks. For example, to give you an example, just recently at EFD board, we approved of a loan to Peru, where the government may or may not, depending on their choice and depending on whether a climate catastrophe takes place, decide to draw on that credit line. Again, we did not do that in the past, but it's one way we can have our financial products evolve and be more innovative to answer the needs of developing countries. Also, I talked about internal reforms within development banks, but also the system could work better. I saw that in the recent annual meetings of the World Bank, the president of the World Bank allowed for massive renewal of co-financing agreement between banks. So it's one thing to be more efficient in each and every institution, but also the system can work better by providing a lower cost and I say more ease or facility to increase cooperation between actors. So that's really amongst the financial institutions. Very important topic, and that's related to the China factor, which you referred to, Anthony. We know that also on top of providing additional finance, one issue is to be able to restructure debt, existing debt, more rapidly. Maybe just to testify, just for my colleagues here at the Treasury are very active to extend the scope of the Paris Club, and in particular give a more important role to China, considering the important role that China has taken in providing loans, in particular, not so much now, but related to the Belt and Road Initiative in the previous year. So now we've seen China co-chair the creditors group for Ethiopia and also more recently for Ghana, so as to improve and include China and limit the risk that there is a separate small multilateral system that begins to emerge on top of the existing one. So again, we tend to think multilateralism in terms of institutions like banks, but there are also other institutions, more informal one like the Paris Club, where it's also important to think about reform and how we give more space to emerging countries and also be realistic on the existing challenges of our time and how we integrate such actors like China. Maybe just a last word on the June summit, the question of special drawing rights, how they can be allocated by the IMF. That's one thing, but we know that the allocation creates many problems. Typically, when 600 billions of SDR equivalent in dollars are created, only 33 go to Africa. And we know it's very difficult to change the IMF quotas because there's a fundamental issue of power sharing behind that. So we know it's complicated. Hence, the push to reallocate these SDRs that typically European countries, but also the US, China, UK, Japan hold in their central banks, do not necessarily need because we have the capacity to create our own currency, but to give again more space for developing countries in the international financial community. Again, if we don't move, we're going to see the tensions increase and increase and increase, and it has to stop at some point. Otherwise, it's becoming a bigger problem. So the June summit, again, it's my interpretation, but the main purpose was to limit and find solutions to reduce the existing failure in the multilateral system, which is an answer to the geopolitical fragmentation that we observe and that you already commented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And if I can just very quickly pick up on one thing that you said there, which was precisely, that you said that the question of quotas and so on is quite complex. But one thing that struck me and that I did mention in the report was that on the European side, and I think very much particularly in France, there is this sense that that the institutions were made for a different era, and that it's not only a question of making them kind of work better and be more innovative, but somehow shifting away from the kind of rather Western-centric structures and kind of shareholding ratios and ownership that they have. And we saw in the summit, in the June summit, quite a clear effort to kind of give countries from the global south, a kind of a role as, a kind of helping to shape the agenda. But I wonder how far you think that can be taken in terms of, how important is it to really change, formally the stake that these countries have in the existing multilateral institutions? Is there a risk that they'll opt out, that they'll go towards other institutions? We see the BRICS being more active now. We see a range of different actors. on the scene. And if we do feel it's important to change that, can the United States be brought on board? Because they do tend to look at everything through a US versus China framing.
Well, I will have to refer to your paper, Anthony, because you isolated a quote by President Macron, who sort of, not in very extremely precise terms, but still opened the way for reform of either quotas, voting rights, in the Bretton Woods institution. So this could be on the table. And again, the ultimate objective would be to make sure that there's just one multilateral system and not more than one. We have seen the creation of the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, a few years back. It's not a massive bank, but still, we observe that when the World Bank is criticized by some, other institutions get created, which can add to the complexity and maybe the fragmentation of the system. In a similar way, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, for example, AIIB, also was created mostly by China, but not only. France is a member, for example, but it shows the fact that more institutions can be created when some do not satisfy all of their shareholders. So I think that discussion has been on the table. The more immediate lesson or conclusion I draw from that is that we have to be quite aggressive on SDR creation and their allocation and rechanneling. So far, only the IMF has designed the scheme through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, plus the PRGT, for those who are familiar with that. But there are other prescribed holders, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. So some others might actually rechannel SDR as a way, not as a first best, but as a second best in terms of reform of the multilateral system. So I think this is how I interpret what has been discussed in France and as soon as last June.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Gunilla, I'm going to you with a question now, but just to mention before I do that, I hope that that our online audience are already writing down their questions in the Q&A or indicating that they'd like to ask a question. I'd like to come to you, so please be be now thinking and putting down what you'd like to ask, because as I said, there's a lot of expertise and knowledge, and you participated in some of these discussions. So it would be great to have that. But Gunilla, if I can just come back to you, you talked a bit about, from the Swedish context, the the emphasis, or the kind of the growing emphasis on the neighborhood, on that vision of kind of Sweden and Europe looking to the areas that are most immediate and urgent in a sort of strategic sense. And you talked about the emphasis more on working with like-minded partners. But I wonder how, whether you see a tension there between that impulse and the other question, which I know you personally have thought a lot about relations with the Global South, about relations with Africa. Is it possible for Europe to do both? How can we, come up with a way of thinking about the multilateral development that is going to bolster the ties that, again, came out very strongly from several of our roundtables, this sense of a kind of loss of trust from the Global South, these problems and divergences. And I think there's a sense in, many people in Europe feel that also is this kind of strategic problem for Europe, given the rising importance of Africa and the rest of the Global South. So how can those two agendas be made coherent?
Yeah, and I think Thomas really put the money talks and the big problems with the Bretton Woods institutions and what was created after the world wars. It's now we are in a different era. I think we have to recognize that, not at least, again, talking about the debt situation. We just passed the millennium work 15 years ago with a huge debt relief. Now we are back in the trap again. So what can we do to have mutual understanding and coming together on really making sure that how we govern our global financial system is a shared one and not fragmented? That's absolutely in the interest of European Union. And here I think a little bit along the lines where we've been working with ECFR as well. I think EU-Africa relations can really show a lot of good examples I mean, how the EU work and integrate as a regional cooperation is not in contrast to a global governance of our global goods, but it's, to me, a precondition. And here I think with our neighboring continent, Africa, using African institutions and, for example, the Africa Development Bank, it's not only about transferring money from Europe to Africa to support development. It's also about expanding markets, understanding better, and with growing businesses and markets, we also have a lot of influence back. So it's not about just pure solidarity or giving away. It's actually about building together. And I think the regional banks can also play a role here in order to help reform the IFIs. France is rather bold here, but I think it's needed because, as you mentioned, the United States was part of the creation of what we see today. And if we don't try to find a long-standing solution, we might lose what we do have today. And I think that's the biggest threat to the multilateral system as we know it, the competition and the fragmentation. And that's why I think working with like-minded, for me, that's also working with Africa, to put the perspective of if we destroy this or not take good care of it, what will then be the alternative? And there I think we still can work with a rules-based system, honoring agreements made, working with human rights, freedom and prosperity. That's why I think we need to be optimistic, and we also need to make sure we have leaders that have the time and the patience to care about the multilateral system, because it's rather cumbersome and complex.
And are you concerned, looking at the political developments in the United States, that we could lose the United States as a partner in multilateral development next year?
So I don't want to speculate around that, but I think we really should, no one should sit there and to threat or to block, but we should also honor the transatlantic link has been of utmost importance for the Europeans. And I don't need to say that in this audience, but also when it comes to global development and cooperation. So I think it's not hopeless, but I think in order to put this on the table, the European Union needs to have its own sovereign thinking around this to really make sure how do we address it in a good way, what kind of partners can we find? And I don't take it for a given that the US will totally oppose it. But again, a lot of things in this is politics. In the end, we have national parliaments that say yes or no to new treaties, to money, and so on and so forth.
Great. So I have plenty more questions myself, but I would like to encourage audience participation. So, I can't see you directly, but I will, take questions. Okay, we have a question. So, is this my colleague Susie Dennison? Are you going to come in and ask your question, or should I ask it? Okay, well, I'll ask the question in that case. I have it here, and this is from Susie Dennison, who leads the European Power Program at she's coming. Okay, Susie can appear and ask her question.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi there. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. Yeah, my question was triggered by the comments which Anthony made in the introduction and others have alluded to about the perceived tensions between the climate agenda and the development agenda in some national settings. And I wanted to get your take on how to deal with this, given I work a lot on the question of climate and sort of how that relates to the broader geopolitical picture, and clearly there is a major perceived breach of trust between countries of the global south and OECD countries, which sort of comes from this question of what are understood as unfulfilled promises when it comes to climate finance. So I wondered if you could sort of put the comments that you've been making about the broader development agenda into the kind of the climate picture, and tell us what you think, how we square this circle with a European domestic environment where we know that in the run-up to the European Parliament elections, the cost of living here in Europe is going to be front and centre, and it's going to be very challenging to sort of justify overseas aid. Do you think there's a kind of a story that as policymakers we can tell that brings this together in a convincing way to the European public? And do you see that working in different ways, maybe in different parts of the EU?
Great, thanks. And in fact, this was pretty much the question that I was going to ask as well. So, and I maybe just to add one element, you know, in terms of the partners that we're dealing with as well, there to some degree, there is this question of whether, you know, the funding is going to different countries, to different partners. Is there a tension there? And I know, again, President Macron has taken, you know, has been very clear that he sees the two as very kind of, you know, integrally connected. But others, including in the roundtable we had in Paris, were questioning, you know, whether in the absence of a major scaling up, whether inevitably there will be some choices. So Thomas, can I come to you first on both the, you know, Susie's and my kind of spin on that question?
Yes, thank you. Now, maybe just a first comment. I would agree with Susie that not fulfilling the commitment to invest 100 billion for climate has been very costly. So it's been costly in foreign relations for sure. And again, but I'm not sure it's too late. We know that in 2020 and 2021, we did not reach the 100 billion. That's for all the annex countries who had planned to invest 100 billion. But the Paris Agreement talked about 100 billion between 2020 and 2025. So it's not too late to actually come a little bit from behind, but maybe catch up at the end of the period, because we were at 85 billion in 2021 and 2020-2021. My understanding, even though we don't have the numbers right now, which is a problem per se, but that we may have been around 100 billion last year. So it means if we were to go higher than this 100 billion in the next 2 years, we could still fulfill that promise and regain some lost credibility. Second point, just maybe to share AFD's experience, AFD provides more than 6 billion of climate finance per year. So we managed to leverage on our balance sheet to provide a vast sum of money. So it's for France alone, last year was around 7.6 billion of climate finance, and AFD was more than 6 billion out of this 7. So France alone already provides more than 7%, almost 8% of the total sum. So I think I don't see actually much of a contradiction between the development agenda and the climate agenda. Again, climate finance works on the principle of co-benefits, which means you finance an infrastructure project, but it has to be resilient to climate change. And in that case, you can report that as a climate finance. So practically, and AFD has roughly 55% of its activities with a climate co-benefit. It means you are able to finance simultaneously development and climate, whether mitigation or adaptation, by the way. Mitigation is a bit less expensive than adaptation, but you can do both. And there are only very few limited sectors where there's a contradiction between climate finance and development. It's almost restricted to electricity production and natural gas at the end of the day. And AFD, we are out of the financing of natural gas, so we don't have any major contradiction in our portfolio. So I think it's a pity that we did not reach the 100 billion, but by doing an additional effort among the MDBs, maybe other bilateral funders, I think we could reach and probably go higher than 100 billion and regain that credibility in the process. But I'm always a bit annoyed by the debate on whether they're compatible or not, because we, on our own activity, we can prove that it's massively the case, actually, that you can do development finance plus climate finance with the same portfolio and have very few contradictions. Now we know there are some afterthoughts, some developing countries are concerned that others may benefit more from the financing, typically small island states, which are currently not very well treated in the existing system. Their GDP per capita is too high. So they expect to benefit more from international funding. Others probably are concerned that it may be at their expense. So there are some undersaid or unsaid afterthoughts. But again, it's not a general contradiction between climate and development, at least as far as I know from my experience.
Gunilla, would you want to say anything on this tension or not?
I like the optimism from Thomas, and I think also we could look, you remember the Millennium Development Goals. It looks rather bleak, 2010, but until 2015, it was a huge rallying around it, and actually a lot of the MDGs were actually met. So time is matters here. But I think if we can look more to innovative way of working together and find ways with guarantees and working together in partnership with business, we might be able to do this. The question is there a contradiction? I would like to say that it depends on how you do climate investments, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, because you have to have the human rights aspect, look into the effects of health and so on and so forth. So it shouldn't be. We have a lot of lessons learned on how we do this in a good way, but also with the ownership and more sustainable with working with also companies, innovative financing, and making sure that this is sustainable. And at the same time, addressing resource mobilization that is domestic. Again, I think as we are going to parliamentary elections for European Parliament, I think quite a lot of factors will say that, well, but China and India are not doing their part of it. Why should Europe always be the blame game? And I think we have to galvanize ourselves a little bit about it and to say, actually, we try to do as good as we can. And also to have some understanding about the tough fiscal pressures that also exists in European states.
Thank you very much. So we have a next question from Yuba Sokona. We'll bring you up now.
Okay. Hi, Gunilla. Hi again.
Hi, long time.
Yes, it's a long time, indeed. We, African experts, we launched recently, independent experts, we launched recently a report on just transition, a climate, energy, and development vision for Africa. In that report, we argue that there is a need to address structural deficiencies in Africa. And then those structural deficiencies, as the African economy suffer at least for 3 structural deficiencies. And then that constant development potential and that constant also climate issues in the continent. The first one is the lack of food sovereignty. I'm not talking about food security, food sovereignty. This is the first deficiency. The second is lack of energy sovereignty. And this is a critical deficit in most of the African countries. And then the last one is low value added content of exports relative to imports. And then these deficiencies in turn contribute to structural trade deficits, weaken African currency and pressure to issue debt denominated in foreign currencies, resulting in a more indebtedness. And then this is a vicious cycle in which the continent are. And then how in that context, Europe, as you clearly indicated, the neighbor to Africa, is partnering in Africa to try to get the continent out of those social deficiencies. We were solving the debt problem. There's no way you can think about debt, food sovereignty. Without debt issue, there is no way energy sovereignty can it. And then the Africans also are facing a dilemma, actually, because many countries will have discovered fossil fuels. At the same time, we need to decarbonize the economy. And then how in that context, there is any possibility of partnership in the African context. And then we know that Europeans are interested on, green hydrogen, but it's from importing from Africa. They are interested on gas. It's also for importing from Africa. It's not to feed the energy deficit on the continent. I just want to have your reaction on those different issues, and I'm sorry to be too long.
No, that you were very to the point. Thank you. Gunilla, should I come to you first on that question of the lack of sovereignty in these areas?
Yes, and if I could, and thank you, Yuba, thanks for joining, and it's so nice to hear you again. But isn't this also about full respect for each other and to building together? Because I think this is also an African leadership, an African capacity building that is very important to see. Why isn't that taking place? I mean, for the food sovereignty, for example. And therefore, I think we have to address the root causes of why this vicious circle is continuing. Because Africa do not lack resources or capacities, but perhaps the systems is not working well enough. And perhaps we also need to a little bit look ourselves in the mirror in Europe, because we have benefited so much of free trade. But right now we put a lot of obstacles for some of the imports from, for example, Africa, when it's about food security, when it's about energy or well, whatever. It's very hard sometimes to meet the regulations from EU that we now are building up, perhaps even more and more. So that in themselves might become a trade obstacle for Africa when Africa and African countries are trying to address the food sovereignty, the energy sovereignty, and to make sure that they better can participate in the global trade. And here I think this is the only sustainable way to move forward. And Europe needs to watch this and perhaps also have better global compacts with Africa and less tariffs and less regulations to be able to booster more of intra-trade, because today it's very, very tiny if we look to the potential. Sorry for not giving you clear answers, but I think this is for Africans to solve themselves as well, and to be able to be more demanding on the systems of the Europeans. And as the Europeans continue with its development aid, really to put in this kind of aspects in building their own capacity base. It's long overdue, and we need some good examples. Thank you for raising this concern.
Great, thank you, Gunilla. And Thomas, I'm sure you have also some thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you, Yuba Sukona, for the question. Happy that you were able to join. I agree with your description that the trade matrix of Africa could be improved, meaning that you did not say that explicitly, but that there's insufficient added value in export and too much reliance on foreign currency for import, which at the end of the day creates a problem of financial sovereignty with countries that depend on foreign currencies and have a big share of their debt in foreign currencies, and you already say that it creates a vulnerability. Maybe two points on which we could probably work more. You may or may not be familiar with the finance in common movement, but the idea is to strengthen financial institutions within developing countries themselves. We know that states have to collect more taxes to finance their public service, but also investment can be and should be probably financed by African institutions based on African currencies. So the capacity to collect savings or to emit bonds from African banks so as to finance investment and not necessarily rely on foreign currencies to finance investment domestically, because this is ultimately what creates a vulnerability when you borrow in euros or in dollars or in renminbis, but to finance an activity that does not necessarily generate such currencies. In that case, you have a mismatch and it's a danger. And we see again, Gunilla was saying that we may relieve a second wave of over-indebtedness, and we are not there yet, but we see the danger of that. And my answer would be we need to invest, but that's not only for Europe, but for Africans themselves, in the domestic financial system, so that the reliance on foreign currencies goes down, and Africa, at the end of the day, will ultimately finance its development mostly by itself. So it can be with support from foreign countries, and it's my day-to-day job, but I also know that the day-to-day job, or the most important job, is to increase the domestic resources in African countries, whether through taxes or mobilization of savings by financial system. And sometimes it's not very sexy, to invest in a bank when you are a French or Swedish taxpayer. You don't necessarily want AFD or SIDA to invest in domestic financial systems, but it's a necessity, and it's something that probably should have been done more in the 90s or early 2000s. It was not very fashionable after the Washington consensus, sorry, to invest in public banks, but we see the consequences of the lack of it. So we know the consequences when public banks are mismanaged, but we also know now the consequences in terms of diminished investment when there are no such public institution able to, in particular, collect savings so as to finance investment. States were a bit left by themselves, and investment was too low or too dependent on foreign currency. So it's a long answer, but I know it's a very serious topic that you raised.
Thank you very much. So we are coming up to the end of our discussion, and I wanted really just to give you both one, final chance to make a few concluding comments. And I guess, happy to hear what you think are the priorities ahead. I'm struck by the number of demands on the multilateral development system at this point. As I said in the paper, the system is becoming increasingly complex. We're looking to it to do, a wider range of things. There's all this desire for innovation, but I think also some concern that, we mustn't leave behind the kind of more traditional goals of, poverty reduction, working in the poorest countries, something that was re-emphasized in the British white paper, provision of essential services, but at the same time, we're working on, new forms of partnership and new financial innovation. And we're doing this in a context where global cooperation is becoming more complicated and more challenging. So just in 2 minutes, I wonder if you could just indicate, what you see as sort of maybe the most crucial sort of, intermediate short-term questions in terms of, where should we focus? What will be the test? What should we look to see whether, we're kind of going in the right direction as the countries of Europe try to work through their thinking and their policies in this area. So maybe Gunilla, if I can come to you first for just 2 minutes, concluding thoughts.
What a difficult question in one way, but can I just say a few things we haven't mentioned today? But obviously, climate comes first to my mind, because we are heading for COP28, but at the same time, we discussed a lot of these kind of distrust has been built up on this historical emissions, but also at the same time not delivering on promises. So what can we do about that? Well, I think the multilateral system, as I said, it's very pragmatical. It's to muddling through, but perhaps also give more kind of innovative partnerships. When Yuba Sukona now, when we spoke about Africa, so why couldn't Europe have a compact with Africa and trying to explore, on a certain topic and to really show good results? Can we think differently and to make things more vivid and rapid within the existing systems? I don't know. There could be more ways to explore, but that will need political leadership and commitment and sustainability. And that's why I wanted to mention the young people's perspectives, perhaps together with businesses and innovation, but also young people's steer and direction could be a source of inspiration. How do we do this in a very, very complex system, as you said, and some fatigue? So we haven't heard voices from the young people today, but perhaps there could be something that makes it more tasty to spend more time and thinking around this, because I think it goes without saying that when we collaborate, we get stronger together. And I think that is a good message for the next generation, but also our historical lessons learned. We have benefited so much as Europeans on the multilateral system. Now it's time to make it really a global functioning work. And that's why we need to include more voices at the table. I think that's my answer to your question. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. A very, very well taken point. Thomas, I'll come to you also on this question.
Gunilla has said it all, so I'm not going to say the same thing in a worse manner. But no, I agree with her that there is more than one policy objective. We had the objective to fight against poverty, and now climate has become an environment in general a major concern, in particular for young people, not only young people, but in particular for young people. I see we have regularly demonstration in the French streets of young people asking for more action on climate, which I see in a very positive way, meaning that there's no fatality, and it is not true that young people will want to close their doors, close their country, and come to the wrong idea that we can solve global problems on our own, because it's not true. But I like the energy that young people bring in the conversation, in particular by adding the climate perspective or objective on top of the fight against poverty. And I see that as more drive, more support for international action, which can again go through multilateral institutions, but also other forms of action. So I see some hope, or at least perspective, by using or answering that energy and this demand from the society to make sure that we don't remain on our own in our own country and forgetting about the need or interest of international cooperation. So I love the energy that I see, even if it comes through a certain level of criticism, but I prefer that to a pure apathy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we are now at the end of our time, but that was a great concluding note from both of you. And I guess the complexity of the subject and the persistence of interest, you know, that you both mentioned within our societies means that we are going to be continuing to work on this subject. So I look forward to remaining in discussion with you and with many of those who are online. Thank you both, Gunilla and Thomas, for your participation. And thank you to the audience for joining. And we look forward to staying in touch. Until next time, goodbye.
Bye.